Without any delay, this is for the student visa. We are here with our esteemed speaker, Mr. William Esterillo, and he is from the US Embassy, New Delhi. And William is, just give me a second. There's some issue with my, okay. Just give me a second. There is some technical glitch. Are you able to see my screen?
No, Janet, you minimized the presentation, I think.
Okay. Right. I think, William, there's some technical issue. I'll be able to share my screen again. William, you can take over the presentation without any further delay. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Janet.
Are you able to see my presentation now?
I think it's coming back online now. So while that's coming back online, let me just introduce myself again. My name is William Astolero. I'm the Deputy NIV Chief, Non-Immigrant Visa Chief at the U.S. Embassy in New Delhi, India. Just for a little bit of background, this is my sixth assignment with the U.S. Department of State. Previous assignments in West Africa, in Mexico, Egypt, as well as a couple of assignments in the United States.
Recording in progress.
Also, as Janet said, this presentation is primarily for F1 students seeking to study in the United States. However, the information is widely applicable to all sorts of student visas. We tend to group Fs, Ms, and Js together. There will be some minor differences, but the information should still be widely applicable. As well, I understand that there are folks from several other countries outside of India on the call today. When talking mostly about the appointment system, that will be specific to India, though it probably won't be too different from what you might experience if you're seeking to apply for a visa outside of India, such as Nepal, Bangladesh, or Pakistan. With that, let's just go right into the presentation. Janet, next slide, please. Okay, so talking about student visas in India, this past summer, as well as last summer and last winter, we have really prioritized student visas. Yes, we have really prioritized student visas. These are one of the most important lines of business that we engage in. We really like supporting students seeking to go on legitimate travel, legitimate study in the United States. So last year for India, this was an all-time record that we hit for issuances over a summer period with 68,000 plus applications that we looked at. And then during the winter, it was another record. We interviewed 41,000 people at the end of last year and early January of this year. So as you can see from the numbers, we interviewed a lot of students last year. Next slide, Janet. Coming into this year, we're shooting even higher. Some of you may have seen some press articles recently about this, but this summer, broadly between May and August, we processed more than 120,000 applicants throughout our 5 posts in India, plus an additional 15,000 through the interview waiver process. Once we have final numbers, that will likely also be a new record. As an aside, I'll just remind folks to just please mute your microphones and turn off those cameras just to save bandwidth so everyone can hear what's going on in the presentation. Thank you. Next slide, Janet. Okay, so applying for a student visa, and again, this also applies to M visas, for instance, if you're going for flight school, or J visas if you're going for some kind of academic exchange or other cultural exchange. Again, the details are specific to India, but pretty applicable to other countries as well. So in order to apply for a student visa, you have 2 options: the in-person interview appointment and an interview waiver appointment. Next slide, please. Okay, so the in-person interview appointment, this is by far how we do the vast majority of our student visa applications. If you're in India, by and large, there are 3 steps. Number 1, you need to go to our, if someone can mute their microphone, you need to create a profile on our scheduling website. That's ustraveldocs.com/IN for India. You may have similar sites in the country where you are. After that, you'll pay your visa application fee. That is non-refundable, just so you're aware. And then if you're in India, you'll schedule 2 separate appointments that I will explain on the next slide. Janet? Okay, so people wonder, why do I have to make 2 appointments if if I just want to do an interview? So the first appointment is for biometric collection. That's your fingerprints and your photo at one of our visa application centers throughout India. That's to help, save you time when you come to the embassy or consulate for your interview and help to cut down on crowds on the day of your interview. After that, your second appointment will be at the U.S. embassy or consulate for your interview. With that appointment, that can generally be 15 days or more before your interview appointment. It could be the day before as well, but depending on your schedule or if you need to travel in order to, get to the VAC or get to the embassy or consulate, that may work better for you. So you do have some options there with regard to how you space out these different interviews that you have to schedule. Next slide, please. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about the interview. I know a lot of folks, you're online. We're not your only source of information. You're probably reading all sorts of things on all sorts of websites, forums, chat groups, Telegram groups, etc. But to be honest, there is a lot of misinformation out there. So I hope folks pay attention for at least the next few minutes. So a few things about your interview. It will likely be very quick. Once you get in, each officer, at least in New Delhi, is doing upwards of 100 interviews a day. So, it's not going to be a 15-minute interview to get like your entire life story. It's going to be much shorter and much more focused. In order to help us focus that interview and get the information we need in order to make a decision, it is best to actually answer the question that's asked and not the one that you want to answer. That is a problem that we run into a lot, especially for folks who have tried to memorize a long speech for us. We don't need a long speech. We don't want a long speech. It's really not necessary for a legitimate student. We're asking pretty simple questions by and large. So you don't need to memorize anything. Just answer directly the question that's actually posed to you. That will more often than not work out best for you. The officer might not look at your documents. You're free to bring any documentation that you feel may be useful to you during the interview, and the officer may ask for it. But more often than not, the only documents that we're going to ask for are your passport and your I-20 or DS 2019 if you're applying for a J1 visa. By and large, that's it. So you can have your diplomas, you can have all your various bank documents there, but we may not ask for them because we already have a lot of information. We have your application, your DS-160, which has a lot of information on it already. And we have you, the applicant, who's there, who we can simply ask a question to rather than, going through a whole ream of documents to find the one piece of information that we need. And beyond that, so as far as the questions, some of them might be kind of personal, which that'll depend on the person. We might ask if you're married or if you have kids or, what your family is doing, either where you live or in the United States, if you have family in the United States. Again, we recommend that you just answer the question honestly and directly. Next slide, please. So when we are interviewing students, what we're looking for are credible students. Now, what does that really mean? Basically, under U.S. law, it is incumbent upon the applicant to convince the interviewing officer, the consular officer, that they are going to apply by all the rules, laws, and regulations with regard to the visa which they are applying for. For a student visa, what we're principally looking for are a few things. One, that your primary purpose of travel is to study. So folks that are seeking to go to the U.S. and they want to enroll in a program that maybe you meet once a semester and you want to work 50 hours a week outside of that one meeting per semester, we're going to have some questions about that. Folks that, for instance, like maybe they want to reunite with family in the United States and they're just taking a course in order to facilitate their travel to the United States, we may have questions about that as well. Because for an F1 visa, you must be primarily traveling for your academic course of study. In order to undertake that course of study, you need to be able to pay for it. So under the law, you have to have funds immediately available to cover that first year of tuition and reasonable expenses. That's, your living accommodations, transportation, food, other sorts of incidental expenses that one would normally incur just by living almost anywhere. Beyond that, there has to be a reasonable plan in place to pay for any subsequent years. So for a bachelor student, you need to convince the officer that the money will be available for those next 3 years for a 4-year program, or that second year for a 2 years graduate program. And we can look at that at various different ways. Sometimes we'll ask for a document. Again, often we won't. So the officer will usually ask you a couple of questions about your funding in order to ascertain whether you really have the funding in place. And then finally, you have to also convince the officer that you're going to return after your temporary stay. So for instance, if you're going to the U.S. to enroll to be closer to all of your immediate and extended family that are in the United States, we're going to have some questions about that, because you have to demonstrate that you're actually going to depart the United States after the end of your program, which could also include OPT after the end of your program, depending on what your plans are. Next slide, Janet. So when you come in for the interview, at the end, the consular officer will provide their decision orally and in writing.
Recording stopped.
And generally, there are 2 or 3 different ways that could go. If you convince the consular officer that you're really going to go and undertake that study and have the money to pay for it, and you're going to leave after the end of it, you'll probably be approved for that visa, and you'll be sent on your way with some instructions on how that passport will get back to you. If you're not approved, you're going to be denied under some section of law, and that will depend a bit. The most common sections of law to be denied or refused a visa under are sections 221G or 214B of the Immigration and Nationality Act of the United States. I'll explain a little bit about.
In progress.
I'll explain a little bit about administrative processing first. That's one reason why someone might get refused 221G. A 221G refusal is not necessarily permanent. We refuse a lot of people under 221G for various reasons. Sometimes the officer needs to do something in the back office with your case, and that might take a couple of days. Sometimes we need more documentation or other information from you. Regardless of the reason for a 221G refusal, you will be provided instructions at that time. And if the consular officer asks you to do anything, you should follow those instructions immediatI-. For instance, sometimes you'll come to the interview and you didn't know that you need to pay a SEVIS fee associated with your I-20. Your passport or your visa cannot be issued absent the payment of that fee to the Department of Homeland Security. So you may be denied under Section 221G until you demonstrate that you paid that fee. In that case, all the action and responsibility is with you, the applicant, at that point, to follow the instructions. And usually it'll be as simple as go home, pay the fee, and then print out the receipt and send it in with your passport back to the embassy or consulate. Other times, if the action is more with the U.S. government, we need to do some additional processing with your case. The instructions may simply be that we will be in touch with you when that processing is complete. You can email to check for an update. But depending on what the processing is, we may or may not be able to give you a firm estimate as to how long that will take. But you can always email for an update if you wish. The other sort of common reason to be refused a student visa is Section 214B of the INA, which basically means that the applicant failed to convince the consular officer, as is required under U.S. law, that they are going to comply by the terms of that visa for a student. That means you fail to convince the officer that that you're a legitimate student, that you're really going to go in and enroll in school, that you had the funding to do so, and that you're going to leave after the end of that course. That's not a permanent ineligibility, but you will again be given this refusal explanation both orally and in writing. The letter will usually be a bit more extensive with regard to what 214B really means. If you happen to get refused under 214B, you should really read the letter before you consider whether to reapply. The officer may not necessarily give you, especially strict or exact reasoning why they're not required to do so. Usually it's just a matter of the applicant just wasn't convincing. They couldn't answer the questions adequately. That's the most common reason why. Next slide, Janet. So what I've been talking about previously is with regard to the in-person interview process. In India, we also have options for certain students or student applicants, if they qualify, to apply via interview waiver. The beginning of the process is pretty similar. You create your online profile with our scheduling website. And as you go through that, you'll be presented with a variety of questions regarding your age, have you had a previous U.S. visa, and a few other things. If you qualify for interview waiver, you'll pay the same fee. And then in India, you'll be required to make an appointment to drop off your documents for interview waiver processing. You will not have to come into the embassy or consulate, at least initially. And once that's dropped off, generally speaking, you're looking at a 2 to 3 week turnaround to get your passport with issued visa back. It depends on local conditions and staffing and other things going on at the post where you made your appointment. For instance, if everyone gets COVID, there's probably less work going on if everyone gets COVID. But that doesn't usually happen. And so for those that apply through the interview waiver process, the vast majority of them are processed and issued without issue, without problem. You'll drop off your documents, and then a week or two later, you'll get your passport back with a visa, and then you'll be done as far as the visa process. Next slide, Janet. So just talking a little bit about how you qualify for interview waiver. Generally speaking, under the current expanded authorities for interview waiver, you can be eligible for an interview waiver appointment if you have previously held any U.S. visa after the age of age 14. And subsequent to that, you were never denied a visa without that denial being overcome in some way. The questions will be pretty obvious. Just answer them honestly. Just a note, if you make a mistake in one of the questions, your visa will usually get, or your passport usually gets sent back to you, and you'll be asked to make a new appointment for an in-person interview. Also in India, we offer a variety of options to drop off and deliver your documents. Let's say you're in Hyderabad, but the best interview waiver appointment for you happens to be in New Delhi. Through the interview waiver process, you do not necessarily have to come all the way up to New Delhi in order to drop off your documents. For a small fee, you can drop it off at a variety of locations throughout India. One thing to note, though, qualifying for interview waiver does not 100% mean that you will not have to go in for an interview. In certain cases, we have to call people in to appear in person at the MCR consulate where you made your appointment. Sometimes it's very simple, a very short interview and giving your fingerprints. Sometimes we need to have a longer interview. It just kind of depends. So just keep that in mind if you are making an interview waiver appointment far from where you actually live. But that said, unless that happens for a small fee, you can drop off your documents at a variety of locations throughout India. And again, for a small fee, you can arrange for your documents to be returned to you through a variety of means at one of our locations, or you can pay for premium courier service to deliver it either to your home or somewhere close by. Next slide, please. Okay, so right now we're in early September. So folks may be wondering, like, when does it actually make sense to apply for a U.S. student visa? So for those of you that are looking to study in the U.S. starting next fall, so that's, August, September, October start dates of 2023. Sooner the better. In India, we do not have those appointments open yet. That's almost a year away. We're just finishing the 2022 students right now. But the two numbers to keep in mind with regard to scheduling your appointment are the number 120 and 30. So what that means is that under U.S. law, when you apply for an F1 visa, if you are applying more than 120 days prior to the start of your academic program in the United States, we legally cannot issue your visa yet. In such a case, your case would be refused under 221G, probably with instructions to send your passport back in later. So your interview's done, your fees are done, your fingerprints are done. You'll just have to send the passport back in once we are within 120 days and can legally issue you that visa if you're otherwise qualified. Beyond that, once your visa is issued and returned to you, you cannot travel to the U.S. more than 30 days before the start of your program. That's a really important number to keep in mind because Customs and Border Protection will not be legally allowed to admit you if you show up 40 days, for instance, prior to the start of your program, if you're seeking to enter on your F1 visa. So you'll really want to keep that in mind. These dates are on your I-20 that you'll receive if and when you get admittance to a U.S. university and you ask for your I-20. Next slide. So that's pretty much it for the presentation. Feel free to take a screenshot of the slide that we're on right now. That's more useful information for you. If you're India, that first link, ustraveldocs.com/IN, that's our scheduling website. If you haven't yet, that's where you will eventually need to start in order to apply for your student visa or any other visa for that matter. And there's an email there if you run into a problem. We also have a call center for our scheduling matters in India, and the numbers are there. With that, I think we only have one slide left, Janet.
Yes.
So now is, perhaps what people were most interested in, which is Q&A. So Janet is going to go through and pluck out some questions, and I will try to answer them as best I can. Just please keep in mind a few things with your questions. One, if you're asking about a process that is specific to a country that's not India, I likely will not be able to answer it, and I will have to refer you to that embassy's website. Also, I cannot answer case-specific questions. Like if you ask, why I was denied a visa, I'm not going to be able to answer that. I don't have the system in front of me, and those records are confidential under U.S. law anyway, so I can't even discuss them publicly if I wanted to. Those issues aside, I'm happy to, try to answer general questions as best as I can. So with that, Jen, if you want to start pulling out questions.
Right. Yes, William. Thank you so much. I think it was a very informative session. And I saw a couple of questions which were asking for the interview waiver program, but then you very much in detail, you have mentioned that as a part of your presentation. So I'm hoping that those questions are already being answered. There are a couple of other questions that I would like to ask you. One of them which I see and which usually the students keep on asking is that there are high possibilities that the students have the other visas. For example, they might have the visitor visa like the B1 B2s, or there might be students who have got their relatives in the US and they might have applied for their immigration files. So my question to you on behalf of the students, because these are also a type of question that I see in the chat box, that if they apply for a student visa while they already have these kind of immigration file going on, or maybe they have their B1 B2s in place, will that hinder their student visas or not?
So that's a good question. That's actually multiple questions kind of wrapped up in one. So let me try to pull that apart a little bit. So if you have an existing tourist visa, the answer is actually very simple. It doesn't really have much of a bearing on your student visa case. You still have to convince the officer of all the same things. You can hold a B1, B2 and an F1 visa at the same time. That's not a problem. It's not like we have to, if we want to issue you an F1 visa, we don't have to cancel your tourist visa. So that's fine. And at least for India, those have different validities as well. The F1 visa typically valid for 5 years. The B1, B2 typically valid for 10 years. But yes, you can hold both if you qualify for both. As far as having a immigrant petition pending on your behalf, that's a bit more complicated because a F1 visa is a non-immigrant visa. So you have to show non-immigrant intent in order to qualify for an F1 visa. But if someone has petitioned for you as an immigrant to permanently settle in the United States as a legal permanent resident, that is immigrant intent. So that can be a little complicated to answer kind of in a vacuum. Those cases, they're actually not that common in India, honestly. And they tend to be very fact dependent. If you are in that situation, I would highly suggest being totally honest and upfront about that if the officer asks you about a pending immigration petition. But that said, the underlying question that people are really getting at is like they're scared of being denied a visa, right? You know, you have these dreams to study in the United States. We have a lot of good schools in the United States, and we like students here in India. So people go through all this trouble. They get I-20s, they lined up funding, they select, they spent hours searching for schools, taking the SAT, ACT, GRE, IELTS. It's a lot of time and a lot of money invested in the process. And it really all comes down to sometimes 2 minutes when you walk into that embassy or consulate. And we understand that.
Right.
So the thing is, though, at least in India, we're approving the vast majority of student applicants, especially the ones that are honest and forthwith the first time they come in. Approval rates are very high. But the way we are able to maintain that is when people are trying to play by the rules, right? So when you come in for your interview, or if you're even doing interview waiver and you're filling out your DS-160, just be honest with us. It's much easier for us to untangle sticky situations that, might be very personal if you're honest from the start. So that is probably the number one piece of advice I would give with regard to that question, in addition to just needing to demonstrate your intent to use the visa as it is intended.
Right. I think that gives quite a good clarity to the students, I'm sure. The other question is that, usually we see that there are a lot of private consultants and agents who, recommend the students to get a bunch of documents, the financial documents, while they're appearing for the student visas. What would you recommend and how important these documents can be?
So it really depends. As I said earlier, we're not usually looking at the documents, right? We understand, at least in India, that folks have a variety of ways to pay for schooling in the United States, which is normally not cheap. You may have existing savings from a previous job. If you have work experience, your parents may have previous savings from their long career saving up to send one or more of their children to the United States. That may be liquid assets, just cash in a bank account. That may be stocks and dividends. That might be immovable assets. That it could be land that they rent out. It could be buildings that they lease out, through apartments. People accumulate money in many different ways. And what we find sometimes is that there are folks who legitimately have the money, but then they're convinced by an agent, no, don't try to explain that you have money from, your parents' 2 flats that they rent out and some ancestral land that you lease out for farming and their savings. You need to show them you just have one bank account that has all of the money in it. And let me help you come up with that document that shows that you have just one bank account. Honestly, it's usually pretty obvious when people are doing that, and it really damages their credibility as an applicant, right? Because if you're lying to us about your funding, the officer's going to wonder, what else are they lying about? And under U.S. law, it's incumbent upon you to convince the officer that you qualify for the visa, which is really hard to do if you start out from a place of dishonesty. So with regard to documents, one, don't do fake documents, please. We really don't want to spend the time going through fake documents, and people get arrested sometimes for fake documents, and that's not a fun experience for anyone involved. We don't want to see people walking out and getting arrested by the police because they were given bad advice to walk in with false documents. So don't do that. With regard to legitimate documents, again, feel free to bring them in. We may not look at them, but if you're going to bring in documents, you should probably understand what's in them. Sometimes we ask someone, about a document and they don't even know what it says. It's not a fake document. They just don't know. They just haven't read it before. For instance, if their parents give them, latest bank statement or something like that, you should probably spend a few minutes looking at it before coming in for your interview. So then if we have a question about it, you can readily respond to that question.
Right. So someone would like to understand that what's the difference between an F1 and a J1 visa? If you can just briefly talk about it, William.
Oh, they have very different purposes. So for most of the folks in here who are either already graduate students or seeking to embark on graduate study in the United States, the F1 is probably what you're looking at. That is the classic study in the United States, go to school, go to class, take your test kind of visa. The J1 visa is a little bit different. It has a bunch of different uses that are not typically for just enrolling in a full course of study at a university. The J1 visa is mostly for our purposes, exchange visas. That could be a sort of exchange as a visiting scholar. So if you already have a graduate degree or, you're looking for a postdoctoral program, you're probably going to be looking more at a J visa. Or if you're looking to do like an internship in the US, that could be a J visa. The number one thing, though, to remember about this, don't worry too much about the visa classifications. That's just that. Honestly, that's mostly technical jargon that us consular officers have to deal with. When you are embarking on your program, the school knows or the institution knows what kind of paperwork to give you, and that will drive what kind of visa you have to apply for.
Right. There are a couple of questions. I would like to club those questions and ask that, is there a significant effect on a student visa when the student is appearing for the visa interview? Does the university makes a really good impact or a bad impact? Is there something like that, or it's very neutral? That's what I understand being an EdUS advisor, but you can just talk more about it.
Oh, absolutely. This is a question we get all the time. So with regard to your choice of institution, under U.S. law, they're all the same. Whether you're studying at Harvard or Yale or somewhere a bit more modest, we have more than 4,000 different institutions of higher education in the United States. They're all ranked differently. Different schools are better at different things. When you come in for your interview, what we're primarily looking for is, does this program make sense for you? Can you explain why you picked this particular school? Let me give you an example. So a lot of times folks come in and, they want to go study at school X, and we ask them, well, how did you find this school? And they said they found it on the internet, and then they can't really explain anything past that, which is a little strange because you can find a lot of schools on the internet. How did you narrow your search down to this one school or just like 2 or 3 schools that you applied to? Or when I ask them, why did you pick this school? And they say, oh, well, it has a library, and it has, a lot of computers in the computer lab for someone who's seeking to study computer science. Spoiler alert, a lot of schools in the US have computer labs with a lot of computers. Most schools have a library. So that doesn't really tell us anything about why you chose that school. And my personal theory is that sometimes folks are scared to tell us why they chose a school because they think it's going to be derogatory, when it's often not. We just need you to help us understand why the program makes sense for you. If your cousin 2 years ago went on a F1 visa to the same school, he had a good experience, and now he's working for Microsoft, yeah, that probably makes sense why you would, highly consider that same school. It worked for him. Why wouldn't it work for you? Or some folks, your auntie might be in the area and she can check on you, have you over for Sunday dinner. That makes sense. Because a lot of schools, honestly, in the US, right, like there's not like a huge difference between them besides like location. That doesn't mean like that both schools will necessarily make the most sense for you. But if you've chosen the school that you chose because you have, some family nearby, like, oh, my aunt's an LPR, she's lived there for 10 years and she can help me, do apartment hunting. Great. Tell us that. Or like, tell us like, what did you tell your parents when you told them what school you're going to be trying to study at? Or rather, sometimes in India, what did your parents tell you when they helped you choose the school that you're going to be studying at in the United States? Tell us that stuff. Don't come in and tell us that, well, the school was founded in 1823 and it's 117 acres, and it's the 3rd largest school in the northern part of the state. Like that, honestly, like those things are not important, and those kinds of responses don't help. If you instead say like, well, my dad and my cousin both went there and they've had good careers after their studies there, they had a good experience. That's an honest answer. Just tell us that.
Right. No, it makes a lot of sense, being honest at the visa interview. So there's one more question from a student who wants to know that if someone was his or her relative in the US and they are ready to sponsor the cost of education while she'll be studying in the United States, is it okay to talk about it while the visa officer asks about that? How will you manage your fundings, or how are you going to manage the cost of education? Your thoughts, William. How should one go about it?
You should absolutely talk about that, because that's the honest answer for how you're actually going to sponsor your studies in the United States. In India, a lot of folks studying in the US have relatives who have already studied in the US, or they might otherwise be there on some other legal status, such as an H-1B. Folks on an H-1B tend to make a decent amount of money, and they might have the wherewithal and the resources to sponsor your studies. If that's the case for you, just tell us that. Don't take fake documents from the travel agency down the street because they think that like we can't read a bank document, or they think that we don't understand that, Indian families support each other, around the world, regardless of where they are, whether it's an H-1B in the US paying for their sister to study in the US, or it's an H-1B in the US, like sending remittances back to their parents. we understand that. We get it.
Right.
Just tell us that.
Yes, absolutely. There is a question which asks that if my education is fully funded by the university, that means the student must have got a full scholarship. Does he still need to show the funds further, or it is being understood that okay, he'll be covered all by the university?
If the university is offering a full scholarship, or maybe you got a partial or full fellowship or assistantship or something like that, it'll be listed on your I-20. So if that is going to be true for you, just make sure the school lists it on the I-20. Otherwise, it doesn't technically count. It's very suspicious when folks tell us, oh, I have this large scholarship from the school directly, and it's not on the I-20 that's also issued by the school. Right, that typically doesn't make a whole lot of sense. And again, like in India, we do a lot of student visas. I've adjudicated thousands of these applicants, and I've supervised thousands more of these interviews. If the funding's coming from the school, that's usually very clear and straightforward.
Exactly, absolutely. There is a question which is about the student visa refusal. It's a very generic question, so I would like to take it here. That will a rejection once on a student visa hamper the second attempt if the student is willing to go for it?
So what I would say about having a previous refusal is, again, be honest about it. Don't try to think that you're going to like sneak one past the consular officer. It's not going to work. It's not going to be a fun interview, and it's not going to work out well for you. That said, there are plenty of applicants that we issue F1 student visas to who have been refused a student visa or another kind of visa in the past. And especially if we're talking about a general 214B refusal, that's not permanent ineligibility. And so during your next interview, if you're able to convince the consular officer that you're going to abide by the terms of the visa and do what you say you're going to do, which is study in the United States, no, having a previous refusal is not a bar or anything like that. But the first step to get issued a visa in that case is be honest and upfront about your any previous applications for a visa that you may have had.
Right. So, there's a very interesting question. Someone has asked that what exactly the consular officer is expecting from a student when they appear for the visa interview. So if you can just, there's a lot of information that you have given, and I'm sure it was very helpful for them. But if you want to just summarize in maybe 4 or 5 sentences, how would you tell that, William?
Oh, I wish I could do it in that short amount of text. But generally speaking, like there are no magic words that we're looking for. There's no magic or one thing that we're looking for besides a credible student, the standard of which we went over previously. Above all, we're looking for honesty, right? That you are going to engage in the study that you say you're going to engage in. That's primarily for academic travel and not, just some other way to get into the United States, and that you can pay for it, and that you are able and willing to leave after the end of your program. That's basically it. And again, in India, we issue the vast majority of the students that we see. I know that there's a lot of strife, a lot of stress, anxiety regarding interviews and appointments. But once you get in, we're issuing the vast majority of these cases. And the best way you can help yourself do that is just be honest. I know in India, there's, when you're going through school, there's a lot of memorization. The U.S. educational system is not necessarily memorization heavy in quite the same way. And when folks come in and they start their interview by reciting a speech that they worked on, that's not helpful to us, because usually that person did not study the information that we're looking for. So again, when we ask you a question, answer the question that we actually asked, and don't just like dump back into like the speech that you decided to, or a travel advisor advised you to try to memorize. Just be honest.
Right. There's one more question which asks that does this visa officer expect that the student have booked any tickets or they have reserved their places on flights? Will those kind of information, be important for a visa interview? Or are there any instances where that the consular officer, they do ask these kind of questions?
So like if we're issuing your visa, we might ask about your flight just to get an idea of like when do you need the visa back by. But like whether you've booked tickets or not for a flight is not going to influence the interview or the adjudication decision even a little bit. Not at all. That said, what we normally advise people is don't buy your ticket until you have a visa in your hand. Some people get themselves in trouble, not necessarily with the visa interview itself. They're qualified for it, but then they see like, they get their interview and they see how long it's going to take for them to get their passport back. And they panic because, I already bought tickets for $2,500. And it's in 3 days, but I'm not going to get my passport back in, for 5 days or something. Sometimes we can help with that. Often we can't. It's a process. It takes time. And so we understand that, at least coming out of India, there are problems with flights, but it's not required to have a flight booked prior to your visa interview.
Right. So there's a question which asks that, is it necessary to visit more countries and get stamps on your visa before you apply for a student visa?
No, not necessarily. Again, just because you may have gone to Thailand and the UAE and Singapore, that doesn't really have much bearing on your qualifications for an F1 visa. There are plenty of people their first trip is to the United States after we issue them an F1 visa. So no, it's not necessary to go around and get stamps. And sometimes we have travel agents that suggest you get stamps either legitimately or illegitimately. I would ignore that advice because usually for a student visa, I'm not like searching for a particular stamp like, they've been to Mexico or they've been to the UK. That has no bearing on the adjudication for a US visa.
Right. So William, when a student tries to fix an appointment for the student visa interview, you see options about the language that you can choose. So there's a question based on this, that if someone is opting for an interview in their regional language, which is an option given in the portal, will that hinder their visa interview because they are not appearing it in English?
I'm so glad you asked that. A few things about language. So in India, we just abolished all language appointments. So in every category, there's just, quote unquote, English visa appointments in your category of choice, whether that's a B1, B2 or an F1 visa or something else. That's just the default name for it. I specifically asked the managers if they could change that, and they said, no, it requires more reprogramming, blah, blah, blah. So that's the default. However, if you appear for the interview and you need translation, just ask. That said, a few things about that. So one, in India is a very diverse country. A lot of languages spoken all throughout India. And certain languages are not necessarily as prevalent in every part of the country. Right. So, if you only speak, Telugu, you're probably going to have more luck if you take an appointment in Hyderabad than if you come up to Delhi or Kolkata or something like that. Now, if it just so happens that, the best appointment available is New Delhi, sure, yeah, you can still take that appointment and you can request translation at that time. I have a feeling this question maybe didn't come from a person in India, since the vast majority of our student applicants speak English, and The thing is, though, if your program says that the student has sufficient English proficiency, we're going to interview you in English because that's a requirement for your program in that case. Now, if you're going to the U.S. for English language study, that's a little bit different. But 99% of our applicants are not going for English language instruction, and so those interviews would typically take place in English. If you need a translator, just ask.
Right, makes sense. So I think, William, we are taking one last question. And
the last one. Okay, make it a good one.
and that's all about, there's a lot of questions about, the wait time for the visa appointments. So would you like to talk about it? There's a lot of wait time that the students are experiencing in terms of the F1 visas. So what would be your guidance about it?
Right. So wait times, right?
Yes.
F1 visas, very popular in India. We can't put infinite appointments out there because who would do the work if I put a million appointments out there? We don't have the consular officers to do a million appointments in India. So that's part of it. Just when demand outstrips supply or capacity, right? However, for this past summer, what we found, we put out more than 120,000 appointments in 4 months, which is the most that India has ever done. And what we found is that as we got towards the end of our season, we had appointments open on the calendar, untaken, untouched. So a few things about appointments. So one, if you're really looking to get an appointment, take the appointment that you can get. It may not necessarily be the appointment that you ideally want. Because I know some people, they take an appointment and then they request an emergency appointment because, I have to be there 30 days before. You can be there 30 days before. You don't have to be there 30 days before. It might be helpful and convenient for you to go earlier, but it's not a requirement for the program. So we seek to get people in for their interviews with enough time to reasonably be able to try to go to make their program start dates. That might only be a couple days before your program starts. So there shouldn't be an expectation that you're going to get your appointment far, far, far in advance. Two, if you do get an appointment, don't switch around all the time. I see a lot of people doing that. And they can sometimes get themselves into trouble with that. Like they get an appointment in post A. They really wanted to interview in post B, but they only had the appointment in post A. And then they try to jump over the post B. They're unsuccessful in getting that appointment at post B, but then they lose their appointment at post A. So then they ended up in an even worse situation than they started in. Finally, with regard to the wait times, once you're accepted by your chosen school in the United States, just be diligent in asking them to generate your I-20 for you, since you can't really complete your DS-160 application or schedule your appointment prior to knowing what your service number is, which is on the DS-1 or the I-20. So just keep timelines in mind. That'll be really helpful. Now, I know folks are looking at the calendar right now, and we don't have any student visa appointments on the calendar right now. That's by design because there aren't many programs starting in the middle of October. We're going to be swapping our focus to some other visa types that we haven't been focusing that much on over the summer. So during the summer is when we do the vast majority of our student appointments. We'll do some more starting in late October through December. So the best way to know when visa appointments are available is just, keep checking our website once or twice a day. Don't hit F5 refresh 50 times a minute. You're going to get locked out for 72 hours. Don't do that. That's not fun for anyone. But usually it's pretty apparent once appointments are available.
Right. And just a follow-up question to that, because
Sure.
you mentioned that as a part of your answer. For example, India, we have multiple consulates and embassy. Does that make a difference if the student is getting the dates not from that region? For example, somebody who is from Mumbai and not getting a date in Mumbai consulate, they appear for an interview in the other consulate where the dates are available. I'm talking about the first date, not
Sure.
they're jumping from one consulate to the other. So Does that make any difference, or is it okay to do that because they're not getting the dates right there?
No, so the U.S. mission to India. So that's the embassy in New Delhi, plus our consulates in Kolkata, Mumbai, Hyderabad, and Chennai. We treat all of India and Bhutan as well as one big consular district. You can apply anywhere in there. It's all kind of the same to us. Your visa fee is good for any of those 5 posts in India, regardless of where in India or Bhutan you may live.
Right. Okay. Sounds good. So William, with that, we are coming at the end of this session, and I would like to thank you so much, for all the answers that you have given us so patiently. And I know there were a lot of questions, but I'm sure that the students have got immense clarity on all the questions and maybe the confusions that they had in their mind related to student visas. And I see a lot of questions which are related to, the scholarships, or related to how should I get an admission? These are my scores. Where should I study? Which are the good universities to study music or film? I would highly recommend that, because you have joined the Education USA Graduate Fair, please make the most out of it. Please go and check the booths of various universities who are offering these programs. All the universities have uploaded their materials and brochures, application fee waivers, scholarship opportunities, all on their booths. So please download them, save it in your bag, and later you can refer all those materials at your comfortable time. But make sure that you download them today, and don't miss to visit the booths of the universities to get more information. Education USA India, Bangladesh, Nepal, Pakistan, they all have their respective booths. So go and visit them, talk to the advisors, know more about the services, and you can go and meet them personally or virtually once you get an appointment from them. So please take the benefit of this virtual fair. And with that, William, I would like to thank you on behalf of all the attendees and myself, for giving such an informative session and giving all the answers of the questions that the students have asked. Thank you so much once again, and wish you all a great time at the fair. Thank you so much for joining in. Have a great evening. Thank you so much.
Thank you, and good luck.
Thank you.